We're going to talk about the end of the campaign of 1960 and two huge breaks that Senator Kennedy got that really put him over the top to be elected president, okay? Because these guys were even. You're going to find out, and I'm giving a prelude to this, but this is going to be the second closest election in American history to that point. Only the election of 1880 was closer, so this one could have gone either way. And so these last-minute breaks at the end of the campaign that Senator Kennedy got were huge in making a difference. Now, I'll just kind of preface this by saying that we're late in the campaign, and Nixon did end his presidential campaign in Michigan. And when he ended it in Michigan, it meant that that was the last state that he went to visit. When he went to Michigan, after just getting back from Alaska, he completed his 50-state pledge. So at the end of the campaign, the last stop that Nixon made was in Michigan. And he went to Michigan right after getting back from Alaska. So he had to hit those two states real late in the campaign, bang, bang, to fulfill that pledge. But he did. So he ended Nixon ended his presidential campaign in Michigan. That was the last state that he visited. And that was right after a grueling trip to Alaska to complete his 50-state promise. Now, Nixon had traveled over 65,000 miles during the campaign. And he gave his final speech as a candidate in Detroit, Michigan. Okay? So that's always kind of significant. Where does the president hopeful give his final speech? Nixon happened to give his in Detroit, Michigan. Okay? And that was the last state he visited, which completed his pledge, having just been to Alaska just previous to that. So he traveled over 65,000 miles and hit every state. Now, Kennedy actually traveled farther, over 100,000 miles during the campaign, but obviously he did not hit every state. Okay? But he traveled farther. So Kennedy will end his campaign at the Boston Garden. He gave his final speech at the Boston Garden after traveling over 100,000 miles. That's a pretty good place. Do you know anything about the hallowed Boston Garden? Cody, you should know something about it. You're a big basketball stud, aren't you? The Boston Garden is the home of the Boston Celtics, who won so many championships in the 50s and 60s, it was unbelievable. The dynasty will never be equal. Well, the Boston Garden was a very popular venue. And Kennedy was bright. He gave his final speech back in Boston, his home area, at the Boston Garden. Now, here are the two big breaks that Senator Kennedy got that really gave him the election over Nixon. And one was Nixon's fault. And he really messed up on this one. He gave Kennedy this break. What do you think the people's perception was of President Eisenhower when he left office? Good, bad, hot, cold? Actually, very good, very hot. Even though he didn't do much, he just had that grandfather grin about him. He was very, very popular, despite the fact he didn't get a lot done. Like I told you before, he didn't do anything to hurt the country, never really did anything to really help the country, and nothing major happened. He had some good things, as Nixon mentioned yesterday in the debate, that happened during those 8 years, so he was very popular. Well, Nixon had too much pride to use Eisenhower late in the campaign for him. Eisenhower was willing to go and talk on Nixon's behalf. He was willing to help him down the stretch, you know what I mean? And Nixon had too much pride, wanted to win the election on his own, and didn't ask Eisenhower for his assistance. Huge mistake. Historians will say that if Eisenhower would have gotten out there late in the campaign and went up and had some speeches and gave him that big grin and made everybody feel good about themselves, about Richard Nixon, that Nixon certainly may have won this election. But he did not use the president in his campaign. The second break was just flat luck. And it doesn't going to make a lot of sense to you at first, but it will. The second break is right at the end of the campaign, before people voted. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia for his stand on civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia because of his stand on civil rights. And you'll learn more about his stands and why you might get arrested maybe a little bit later, but we'll give you a little bit of a preview. But he was arrested just before the end of the campaign, before people went to the polls. And they sentenced him, the Georgia officials sentenced him to 6 months in jail at the Georgia State Penitentiary, which was hundreds of miles from Atlanta. Really not for anything that really mattered. I mean, he was protesting, he was violating the law, but they really stuck it to him. They didn't like him down in Georgia because of his civil rights campaign, and they arrested him, they tried him, and they sentenced him to 6 months in jail at the Georgia State Penitentiary, which was really very isolated, hundreds of miles from Atlanta. Why would that concern you if you were Martin Luther King Jr. or maybe his family or followers, that he would be sentenced to 6 months in prison at the Georgia State Penitentiary a long ways from Atlanta? What might be your concern? Is he very well liked? How many, you know, what's going to happen to him in prison? Yeah. And so there was a lot of concern, a lot of fear on the part of the family and his supporters that he would not come out of that 6-month sentence alive. That takes us to the break in our handout. I want you to take your handout out, and I'm going to read it with you here. Okay? So you have this handout, and this comes from a really cool book, if you get a chance. This is a book that was written by Jeff Greenfield fairly recently of what would have happened if Kennedy lived. The first and second terms of John F. Kennedy, which obviously did not happen. But it's a very good book on scenarios of what would have happened if Kennedy would have lived, but it talks about some things that happened while he did. And this comes from pages 14 through 17 of that book, and it covers really two interesting facets, and we'll read it. We're going to start down here. Oh, I got the wrong one. No, it starts on this side here. It starts, the Republican Party was a serious. So get on the page, it says the Republican Party was a serious contender for the Negro vote. Republicans were some of the strongest civil rights champions in the Congress, while Democrat powers like Russell of Georgia, Byrd of Virginia, and Eastland of Mississippi were the latest in a century-long line of Democrats determined to keep blacks in a state of near bondage and peonage. The Republican nominee, Richard Nixon, had so impressed Martin Luther King Jr. with his commitment to equality that most of King's associates were betting that he would endorse Nixon for president. In fact, Martin Luther King Sr., the young Reverend's father and one of the most influential black ministers in America, had signed a newspaper ad endorsing Nixon out of fear of a Catholic in the White House. Now that's interesting because he's discriminating against Catholics but didn't want anybody to discriminate against blacks. This is really interesting. Imagine Martin Luther King having a bigot for a father, Kennedy said to a campaign aide, Harris Woolford. Then grinning, he said, "Well, we all have fathers, don't we?" I want to read that again, and you tell me what you think Kennedy meant by that. Imagine Martin Luther King having a bigot for a father, Kennedy said to campaign aide Harris Woolford. Then grinning, this is kind of the Kennedy wit, he added, "Well, we all have fathers, don't we?" What's he mean by that? Think about it. What's it mean by that?
They're not the same person.
Yes, and sometimes fathers are kind of a pain, aren't they? Because I talked to a person today, a father who wants his kid to go to college worse than the kid wants to go to college. John Kennedy expressed a lot of pressure from his father. You'll hear more about it later. And so his father wasn't perfect, and he knew his father wasn't perfect. So what he's saying by that comment is, we all have fathers, don't we? And somebody said exactly right, Courtney, you can't judge a book by its cover. You can't judge Martin Luther King Jr. by what Martin Luther King Sr. is doing. Just as John Kennedy didn't want himself judged by things that his father did. Okay? He said, then on October 19th, King was arrested at an Atlanta sit-in for trespassing. You know what a sit-in is?
Yeah.
Okay, where you're not allowed in a restaurant. Brooke, go ahead. What do you think it is? Yeah, you're not allowed in this restaurant because they don't serve black people, so you go in and sit anyway, and then they arrest you and send you to jail, okay? We'll talk about more about that later too. So King was arrested at an Atlanta sit-in for trespassing, spending the night in jail for the first time in his life. When he appeared a few days later before a militant segregationist judge, he found himself charged with a trumped-up parole violation and sentenced to 6 months in jail at Georgia State Penitentiary at Reidsville, hundreds of miles from Atlanta. His wife feared he would never come out of there alive. She called Woolford, who in turn pressured Sergeant Shriver, Kennedy's brother-in-law, who, after carefully making sure that none of the candidate's top aides were within hearing range, persuaded Kennedy to call Mrs. King to express his concern. The reaction within the campaign was explosive. Bobby, which was Bobby Kennedy, his brother, Bobby was so furious that he phoned Shriver and tore into him with such vehemence that it opened up a years-long rift. Summoning Woodford and Lewis Martin, the top Negro in the campaign, he said, "Do you know that 3 Southern governors told us that if Jack supported Jimmy Hoffa, Nikita Khrushchev, or Martin Luther King, they would throw their state to Nixon? Do you know that this election may be razor close and you probably lost it for us?" That was Bobby Kennedy's perspective if his brother called Martin Luther King's wife. He was actually totally wrong here, okay? What Bobby didn't tell them that was that on the advice of the Secretary of the Georgia Democratic Party, he had already called the judge who had thrown King in prison and urged him to release the minister on bond. Along with pressure from the governor, the judge did exactly that, and that's when King's father stepped front and center. Now I want to go back and say what happened here. Sergeant Shriver was so adamant that he wanted John Kennedy to call Mrs. King that he dialed the number and put the phone in the president's hand next to his ear and said, "You talk to her." Bobby Kennedy reacted initially that it was a bad idea. And he was pissed off because he already was working in the background on the judge. And he didn't want any interference or his brother doing anything that would screw up his efforts. Do you see what I mean? These guys were pretty smart and a little bit conniving. Okay? So where are we at here? It says, along with the pressure from the governor, the judge did exactly that, and that's when King's father stepped front and center. He didn't just officially endorse Kennedy, he did much more. "I had expected to vote against Senator Kennedy because of his religion," Daddy King said, which still kind of amazes me. "But now he can be my president, Catholic or whatever he is. It took courage to call my daughter-in-law at a time like that. He has the moral courage to stand up for what he knows is right. I've got all my votes and I've got a suitcase and I'm going to take them up there and dump them in his lap." Almost immediately, Lewis Martin began to, I can't remember what that sentence. Calling journalists, thank you, around the country. He usually avoided the white press. Papers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Washington Afro-American promptly featured the story. For its part, the campaign distributed some 2 million pamphlets under the name of the Freedom Crusade Committee with the headline, "No comment. Nixon versus a candidate with a heart, Senator Kennedy." For Nixon, the frustration must have been palatable. He urged the Justice Department to intervene only to be told that it was a matter for the state of Georgia to resolve. It was impossible to prove the impact of those phone calls or Daddy King's statement, or the massive distribution of that pamphlet in black neighborhoods across the country. The analytical tools of 1960 weren't that sophisticated. But here's what was known. In a black enclave in Philadelphia where Adlai Stevenson, had won about 75% of the vote, Kennedy won almost 85%. In a black neighborhood in Pittsburgh where Stevenson had won 2-1, Kennedy won 4-1. Because black people normally vote for the Democratic Party in this time in history. So they're comparing Stevenson, what he did in 56, to what Kennedy did in 60. In New York's most heavily black neighborhood, Stevenson had won 2/3 of the vote, Kennedy won 3/4 of the vote. In New Jersey, some 125,000 blacks had voted for JFK. He won the state by 30,000 votes, a margin of less than 1%. As for Illinois, where Kennedy won by 8,000 highly dubious votes, one aide noted, without the Negroes, he wouldn't have been close enough to steal, not saying that we stole it. We'll talk about that later, the Illinois vote. Even in the South, the black vote was critical. For all the talk of LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, as the key to Texas, the black vote in Houston, which had given Stevenson 12,000 votes, gave Kennedy more than 22,300 votes. And the Negro vote in Louisiana and the Carolinas was crucial to Kennedy's narrow victories there. The link between those phone calls and his historically close victory was not obvious, but there were times when he allowed himself to think, if he had not called Coretta Scott King, if his brother had not called the judge, if Daddy King had not expressed his gratitude so powerfully, if the black vote had not come out as enthusiastically as it did, Richard Nixon would have likely won the White House. And what would a President Nixon have done? if he had confronted the Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, if he had taken every ounce of presidential insistence to keep Kennedy's advisors, military and civilian, from launching an airstrike with God knows what consequences, with a Nixon in the White House. Incredible that Kennedy's presidency and the fate of the world might have hinged on a couple of telephone calls. Then again, it might have also hinged on how his wife had been feeling on a Sunday morning almost 3 years ago. Think about that. If he doesn't make this phone call, and Bobby Kennedy maybe doesn't make his phone call, Richard Nixon probably wins the presidency, and you'll find out when we get to the end of this, because of the Negro vote going the other way. You have a Cuban Missile Crisis in which I am not sure any man in history could have handled it better to keep us out of a jam. And I really believe, and I think historians will say the same, that Kennedy got so much pressure to launch nuclear weapons and attack Cuba and invade Cuba, which would have led to a World War III, no doubt. He got so much pressure from the military to do that, and he wouldn't at all concede to their request. He wanted to work out a peaceful solution. People think Nixon would not have done that. So this 2 phone calls probably affected history, and we certainly wouldn't be in here talking about this at all in the detail we are if this would have happened. Yeah.
So what is he talking about?
They're talking about all this stuff after Kennedy was elected, so what Martin Luther King's wife felt like 3 years prior to that, when she was scared for her husband's life and that. And they got him out. So that's just an incredible piece of history that not a lot of people know, that if it wasn't for a couple of phone calls late in the campaign, Richard Nixon probably is the President of the United States. Okay, let's talk about the final results of the campaign, and you'll see what I mean by such a close election. Okay? So, according to the 1960 Census Bureau, which is the people that tell you how many people live in the country, they estimated that the population of the United States was approximately 180 million people. That's how many people lived in the United States in 1960, according to the census. Now, of these 180 million people, they figured that about 18 million were Negroes. Okay? And what do you think 40 million were that would be important for Kennedy at this point after our discussion? Catholics. Very good. Catholics. So that was the census prior to the election. Now, I'm going to give you the result of the election, but like I mentioned, this is going to be the second closest presidential election in American history. Only the election of 1880, when James Garfield defeated Winfield Hancock, and you might remember that from last year, probably not. He beat him by just 2,018 popular votes. You don't have to write all this down. And he only beat him by 59 electoral votes. So prior to 1880, this is going to be the closest election in American history. Now, let's look at this little perspective here. There were, I'm going to write this so we get it right, because you can write this down because it's kind of important in a way. Here's how many people voted in this election. This is how many votes were cast. 68,450,990. That was the popular votes that were cast in the election of 1960. Now, if you look at here, we're looking at about 120, right? But that's the population was 180. That was the best voter turnout in American history to that point. That's how interested people were in this election. Okay, the popular vote. We have 3 candidates. Who are the 3 candidates? We know Kennedy's a candidate. We know Nixon's a candidate. But don't forget old Senator Byrd. Remember, he ran in there. Well, he had 116,248 popular votes. That was Byrd. Okay, so he did get a little bit of interest. Okay. Nixon had 34,107,646. That's how much Nixon had. And Kennedy had 34,227,096. Pretty close. Here's the difference. 119,450 vote differences on it. That's a pretty close election. So that's the popular vote. Now that's actually I'll really get mathematical on you here. I figured this one. So this difference is right here. 0.00174801,274. There's the percent that Kennedy defeated Nixon in the popular vote, right there. That's 1/5 of 1% for you math majors. 1/5 of 1%. So very close, but as we know from the election of 2016, popular votes don't do you much good. So Kennedy had a little more success in the Electoral College. You needed 269 votes in this election to become president. There were 537 possible. And if you were going to win the presidency in 1960, you had to have 269 electoral votes.
How many?
269 out of 537. That's what you had to have to win. Now this was fairly close because Kennedy had 303, which was more than the 269 compared to Nixon's 219. So it was a very, very close election in both the popular vote and the electoral vote. Again, Kennedy receives 303 electoral votes, Nixon 219. There's 15 votes missing. Where'd they go? Byrd. Byrd got 15 electoral votes. So, Kennedy 303, Nixon 219, Byrd 15. Can you understand the importance of this right here in this election? I don't know if you can emphasize it enough. And that close of an election. And this probably makes the difference. Now these aren't all voters obviously, but this makes the difference in the election, and those 2 phone calls might have made that difference. That's how close this election was. So with this victory,